By the autumn of 1944, the Allies had swept across Western Europe. They had secured the beaches of Normandy, liberated Paris, and were pushing hard toward the German homeland. To many soldiers on the ground, the end of the war felt entirely within reach. But that rapid advance had a hidden cost. The Allied armies had pushed forward so fast that their logistical networks couldn't keep up. Supply lines stretching all the way back to the French coast were pulled to the breaking point. To compensate for the shortages, commanders concentrated their strength in the north and south, leaving a thin line of troops in the center, nestled in the dense Ardennes Forest. This was treated as a ghost front. It was manned by battered divisions needing rest and raw, untested replacements who expected to spend a quiet winter in the woods. The speed of the liberation had outpaced the ability to supply it. By mid-December, the Allied High Command was already focused on their own next offensive, leaving a vulnerable gap in the Ardennes that German intelligence had been watching for months. Out of the freezing fog on December 16th, the forest erupted. Germany had secretly moved vast amounts of troops, artillery, and equipment through the dark, achieving total tactical surprise against the American line. Hitler's objective was highly specific. He intended to drive a wedge right through the center of the Allied front, splitting the British and American armies in half. From there, his panzer divisions would capture the vital deep-water port of Antwerp, choking off Allied supplies and forcing a negotiated peace. The timing of the attack was entirely deliberate. A severe winter storm had blanketed the region, neutralizing the Allies' greatest military advantage, their air power. Planes couldn't fly in the blizzard, and aerial reconnaissance was completely grounded. Under the weight of this massive armor thrust, the thin American line buckled. In the Schnee-Eifel region, 2 entire U.S. infantry regiments were surrounded and swallowed up. Nearly 8,000 Americans were captured or killed in a matter of days, the most serious defeat suffered by American forces in the European theater. On the strategic maps at headquarters, this German penetration caused the Allied defensive line to cave, bowing 50 miles inward across Belgium and Luxembourg. This massive physical swelling in the front lines created the distinct shape that gave the battle its name, the Bulge. The remnants of the American forces were now trapped in a fractured, frozen landscape. High-level strategy had broken down. The defense of the Western Front now rested entirely on the shoulders of the isolated men on the ground. With communications severed and command structure shattered, the battle fragmented into hundreds of chaotic micro-wars. GIs were fighting in the dark, often completely blind to where their own reinforcements were. The defense fell to whoever was holding a weapon. Scratch groups formed in the snow, conglomerations of disorganized stragglers, headquarters clerks and cooks, ordered to dig into the frozen earth and hold the line. They fought in knee-deep snow, with temperatures plunging well below freezing. Men lacked winter coats or proper boots. They hacked foxholes out of the screams of incoming German 88mm artillery. In these isolated pockets, individual soldiers waged a desperate defense. Single infantrymen stepped into the open to fire bazooka rounds at advancing Panther tanks. Medics exhausted their supplies and became casualties themselves as they tried to pull the wounded from the snowdrifts. Hitler's meticulous timetable relied on constant forward speed, but the German columns found themselves blocked at every crossroads and forest trail by the uncoordinated obstinacy of American squads refusing to yield their ground. The most critical of these roadblocks was Bastogne. 7 major roads converged on this small Belgian town. Recognizing its importance, the Germans simply bypassed the entrenched American forces, swallowing the town and cutting it off entirely. Inside that pocket, the situation was nearing collapse. Elements of the 101st Airborne and the 10th Armored Division were vastly outnumbered. They had no winter clothing, their medical aid stations were overrun, and their artillery ammunition was gone. On December 22nd, the German commander sent a formal, typewritten ultimatum across the lines. It offered the Americans a stark choice: the honorable surrender of the encircled town or face total annihilation by massed artillery. General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne, read the note, crumpled it, and issued his official one-word reply to the German army: nuts. That single defiant syllable epitomized the immovable psychological wall that the German panzer armies had finally slammed into. By holding Bastogne and dozens of other small junctions, the Americans bought the one thing the Allies desperately needed: time. Forced to detour onto narrow, muddy trails, the massive German tanks burned through their limited fuel reserves and ground to a halt. Then the weather finally broke. The thick winter fog lifted and the skies over the Ardennes cleared. Thousands of Allied bombers and fighter planes immediately flooded the airspace. They began pounding the exposed, stalled columns of German armor, shattering their supply lines from above. On the ground, General George Patton's Third Army drove relentlessly northward, slicing through the German ring around Bastogne. The immense pressure of the Allied counteroffensive began to push the enemy back, physically flattening the bulge in the map. Without the cover of the winter storm, the German offensive was completely exposed. The delays forced by American infantry had starved the panzer divisions of their momentum, leaving them vulnerable to systematic destruction. The line had held, but the toll was staggering. 19,000 American soldiers lost their lives in the freezing forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, making the Battle of the Bulge the bloodiest single battle of World War II for the United States. For Germany, the cost was terminal. Hitler had poured the last of his nation's heavy armor and veteran reserves into this massive gamble. When it failed, the back of the Nazi war machine was permanently broken. The official military history records the movement of divisions and the clash of panzer armies. On the ground, the Ardennes was defined by much smaller moments: the sound of a single bazooka, the smell of frozen pine, and the isolation of a foxhole. Hitler's final gamble relied on a rapid, clean breakthrough that never materialized. The complex German plan was dismantled by the individual willpower of soldiers who held their ground even after the high-level strategy had failed them.